And now, get ready for David's Shining Star, a new podcast with your host, Kirk Cox, where we will discuss survival in the toughest of times, dealing with the grief from the loss of a loved one. Stay tuned and listen in. Welcome to the show today. This is episode 4, and before we get started, I would just like to stop and say today is a very special and memorable day for me, as this is the day 13 years ago that I lost my mother. And so as we begin this episode, I would like to just dedicate it to Mom, and I pray that she somehow, some way is seen and is proud. I'd like to welcome you once again to David's Shining Star, and I'd like to thank you for tuning in today. I'm very grateful for all those who have liked, commented, and shared our show. You know, last episode we talked about my journey leading up to my father's passing and how that impacted me. To be honest, I realized in putting the last episode together that I truly hadn't spent a lot of time grieving for my father. And this struck me in the midst of trying to video the show, to be honest. And what I want to do is just open up and be vulnerable. And so if I am, it's intended, not on purpose, but it's just intended to show that it's okay. You know, I stated last time that I was in that anger part of my grief for Dad, and actually for good reason. I remember telling my siblings that I believed it would be the last time we would see our stepmother. And it was. She wanted to be done with my father and his family for some reason, which I never found out why. She'd already convinced him to change his will, and to be honest, I was really still too numb to worry about it. And she had already given my brother what little furniture she didn't want without asking anyone else. And as I had 3 siblings, we sat down following the funeral. Once again, I was numb and I was there. But she basically had a box with a few memorable items in it and placed them on the floor and instructed us to go through them ourselves and get what we wanted. The only thing I really wanted was my family's Bible that my grandmother had kept for many years. You know, the very large family Bible, the ones that families had years ago, where people recorded all the family major events, such as weddings and births and things that impacted the family that was beneficial for those of us who are around now to look back and have those dates and times, along with pictures and other things. My stepmother didn't even want the flag that came as a part of the military funeral that my father had. All of this bothered me extremely, and it still does today. They were married when I was a teenager, just to tell you how long it had been since she had become a part of our extended family. But now I had the feeling that all of that was over, and it was. I was never able to understand that as she would pass away a few years later, why this ended the way it did. But it did. And so life goes on, no matter where we are with grief, no matter how much we suffer in that grief. And it is up to us to find a way to navigate through it. Allow me to read a quote I saved for this show. It was written by Nikki Banas. It says, "This is for the ones who are struggling right now. This is for the ones who have been having a rough day or week or even year. The ones who feel like this storm will never end. Keep fighting for you, not for your friends, not for your family, but for you. Keep fighting because deep down, you hold a tiny voice that knows you are meant for far more than this sadness and pain you are feeling. Keep fighting because the person you will be on the other side of all this is cheering for you so much. Keep fighting because you will get there, and it will be worth it." I know that many of us feel that we never will get through it, but we can. It's just one step at a time. And I'm not saying that grief will go away, because I don't believe it ever will. It hasn't for me. But you can somewhat try to regulate and normalize it where it doesn't approach you so unexpectedly. And so, you know, as I attempted to return to somewhat of a normal state, back at home and living close to my mother, I began to see a decline in my mother's health. I'd spent a lot of time over the years taking Mom to MD Anderson, as she was one of their longtime cancer survivors. And for those of you who have dealt with or know someone who's dealt with cancer, you understand how rough it can be. She battled cancer not once, but multiple times. And when I say my mother was a tough woman, I said that in an earlier episode, she was. She had 2 mastectomies at separate times. You know, her first bout with cancer was when I was maybe 8 or 9 years old. And back then, the treatment was very different than it is today. I really didn't know a whole lot about cancer. I just knew my mom was sick. And in fact, I remember going to the hospital. They wouldn't let us in because we were under 12 years old. So I remember waving to her from the parking lot. She managed to make it to the window just to wave and let us know that she was going to be okay. But she was given high doses of radiation back then. It's something that they did. And then chemo, which was a fairly new process back then. And so that was a rough bout, but she seemed to stay tough with it and managed to keep going and raising her children and managing the household very well. They would take some lymph nodes during her next fight, along with the chemo. And it was that time that I remember that she got very sick from all of it. And due to the fact that she had survived all of that, she had become enrolled in a special program for long-term survivors, which included visits to MD Anderson at various times through the year and different tests that they did, which I took her to many times, most of the time, in fact. I became all too familiar with cancer and had a hard time seeing folks going through the process, particularly children. You know, back in those days, in the old MD Anderson Hospital in Houston, you know, people would be lined up in the halls waiting for treatment and appointments. And so you would see various stages of cancer, folks that had lost their hair. And the saddest thing ever, I believe, was to see a young child with cancer and had lost her hair and just looked frail. But however, now I look back and I feel blessed to have been able to take my mother to her appointments, as she all too many times bravely fought that cancer. And she won for many years. You know, when we went, the fine folks at MD Anderson always questioned her patient number. That's one of the things that they assign you when you have cancer or diagnosed and you're a patient with MD Anderson. They give you a number. And so I didn't know all of this until they explained it. The lower the number meant that you had survived a longer period of time. And she had. Every time we would go, they'd say, "Are you sure that's your number?" And, "Yeah, we're sure." Can't imagine that you're still here. It's just amazing. And one of the things that my mom took on following my grandmother's death was to be my aunt's guardian. Now, understand that, you know, she had these bouts of cancer and was trying to raise children through school and keep a job and all of that. But she also promised my grandmother that she would be the guardian over my aunt. My aunt, as a baby, actually had suffered a severe rheumatic fever, and it resulted in her having seizures, and she had to be put on medication. And just, I mean, the process and the understanding of it was very limited back then. And so they ended up basically labeling her as mentally retarded. She really wasn't mentally retarded, but her growth in her brain was limited. And so I would say at best she had the mental capacity maybe of a teenager. And after a while, my grandmother placed her in a nice facility in Houston that was designed for mentally retarded when my grandmother was unable to take care of her. So my mother made frequent visits to visit and check on her. And I was blessed to be asked to take her there many times. And eventually she would ask me to assume this responsibility should something happen to my mother. Now, you know, of course, at the time, no one wants to think about, you know, losing your mother. And so when she asked, I said, yes, you know, but at the same time, I couldn't imagine losing my mother. She'd been so tough, gone through so much. I guess I just didn't want to face the fact that she would eventually get older and that her health would decline. And to be honest, I figured my aunt would die before my mother, but it wasn't the case. So as both Mom and my aunt got older, Mom decided to move my aunt to a nursing home nearby. It was actually a very good nursing home. And when the facility my aunt was at informed her that they could no longer care for her, then Mom made this decision to move her to the nursing home. In the early days, they never imagined my aunt living as long as she did, just as I was saying earlier, and more on that later. But as time went on, the family began noticing my mother showing these early signs of dementia, which, if you've never ever dealt with it, it can be horrifying. In fact, it is a horrifying disease for those who go through it. And some go through much worse scenarios than even what we went through. So there I was, still struggling with my grief over my son David, and still really hadn't faced the grief from my dad. And now my mom's memory was slowly fading. Mom had expressed to me that she did not want to be placed in a nursing home, as I imagine she knew the repercussions of having dementia and not knowing where you are, and understanding that that could have major impact on her. I've seen people who were put in homes just basically just hang it up and give up. And so I wanted to make sure her wishes were kept. And so as that dementia got worse, my siblings offered and suggested that we put her in a nursing home, which I knew she didn't want. So I basically fought back with them and told them, look, as long as I'm able to take care of her, I want her to stay home. So I began making daily visits to ensure she was eating and taking her meds. And although this was not an easy task, as I'd already witnessed my father with dementia, I felt very driven to take care of Mom as long as possible. She took care of us. She fought through it with cancer, with everything she had to face. And she wanted me to take care of her and take care of my aunt. And so I did that. And before her condition really worsened, here again, she was diagnosed with another cancer. And thank God for the MD Anderson. They began doing PET scans on her, which is a very inclusive scan that can detect very early signs of cancer. And so they detected some in her thyroid. So they gave her a choice of having surgery and removing the thyroid. She contemplated that and decided to allow the doctor to remove her thyroid. I didn't speak up. At the time, I really wondered if she was able to endure that surgery, and although they said that she would be fine, I just really wasn't sure. But I didn't voice my opinion. I just wanted it to be hers. So when they performed the operation, they managed to nick her vocal cord in that operation, and it caused her voice to go. So she basically lost her voice that day and during surgery. And when I think back on that now, I really regret not telling her just to let it go. And I would find out later that most thyroid cancer is not fatal, and she would have been fine just living with it until she did pass away of old age or whatever else. And so, once again, that guilt part, it comes to play. And I know that if you suffer with grief, it's easy to have that guilt. And the guilt part of me not saying something, I still struggle with that today. There was really only a few things that she really continued to do as dementia came on. She knew she couldn't drive. She knew she had to stay in familiar places. And so the church was one of the things that she loved, and she was always a member of the choir. And she had been attending the church she was going to for years and sang in the choir. But when her vocal cord became damaged, she could no longer sing. And though they said things could change and return to normal, and her voice did come back, but her will is what happened. It lost. She lost her will, and she continued to just fade as that will was lost. I know for those who grieve, it might seem odd to say, but seeing someone suffer with dementia is extremely difficult. The only blessing outside of finding a cure is to pray that your loved one doesn't have to continue down this path very long, because it's very brutal. It's just a very horrifying, sickening disease. And I've known too many people who suffer so long that they don't even remember their loved ones anymore. And that in itself is a form of grief. And to be honest, I don't know if I could have faced that. But once again, life goes on, and things happen not in my time and will, but in God's time and will. And it's extremely difficult to watch someone suffer with dementia, and it was for me to watch my mom. I had to learn how to speak to her because she would repeat the same things over and over again. I would have to basically say and do things that didn't upset her because If I reminded her that she had said something, it might upset her. So I just acted like I'd never heard it and just went on with that. And so to me, it was another form of grief, especially spending the amount of time I did with her. The bright side of many with dementia, if there is a bright side, is that often the memories of old start shining through. And it's not the first time I'd go through this either. But I would hear Mom's stories of her life. And many of those stories I'd never heard. So I cherish those stories. I actually enjoyed listening to them and learning more about my mother as a child and the things that she went through. It helped me to understand her, things I'd never heard. And just a side note, the same thing happened with my dad. And I remember him talking to me about World War II, which he served in. He had never spoken one word about being in the military to us. So I was able to hear those stories and others, which actually brought me closer to my dad before he died. Mom would eventually end up in the hospital her last time. And as she was fading towards death, I really wasn't sure I could handle losing my mom. I remember witnessing her seemingly fighting to stay alive towards the end, which added to my overall time with grief. So here it was, my son was gone, my dad, and I really wasn't prepared now to lose Mom. She was the one that I leaned on through my troubles as I tried to be there for hers. You know, when she needed something, I would do my best to make sure that she was taken care of. And now there was nothing I could do to delay God's timing. I remember so vividly my last time with Mom. She was basically incoherent and slipping away. It's often said, and I've seen this more than once, so I know for a fact that folks that are about to pass away will have a bright moment sometimes. And she had a bright moment where she basically woke up, looked at me, and began talking to me the best way she could. And it dawned on me suddenly that she was fighting. She didn't want to let go because she was worried about my aunt and what would happen with her, even though I'd promised her I would take care of her. But it was then that it hit me. And as I had that short last conversation, there were two things I really felt she needed to hear. While she had been fighting dementia, I managed to finish my degree, which she had always wanted me to do and encouraged me and kept after me to do it. And I did it. And so as I was there with her, I told her, I said, Mom, I finished that degree. And she smiled. So I got one last smile out of her. I also told Mom, I said, Mom, don't worry about Dottie. That was my aunt's name. I said, I've got this. I'll take care of her. And that was basically it. That was her big concern. And Mom would go on to pass that night. Today marks that day, 13 years ago, that she passed. And I'm putting the episode together on that day just to honor her. I remember basically losing it when she passed, and the hole I already had for my son just grew larger with Mom passing. I now felt more alone and emptier than I had in a long time. You know, Mom had gone through several funerals being a pastor's wife, and she had made a decision to be cremated, which at the time I really wasn't happy about. I just didn't understand it. She had planned every part of her funeral in advance, so her kids would not have to worry or struggle in making those decisions or those plans, because it's tough when there are no plans to try to get together and make plans. She decided that she wanted to be cremated, and instead of a funeral service, she wanted a memorial or a tribute to her that she wanted to be more uplifting than anything else. She didn't want people being sad and crying. You can't control that, but it's easier said than done, as we all grieved greatly. It would be her decision in this service and hers that would change my mind about what I would want. And as a result, just to be honest, of all the too many funerals I've had to attend in both in my life and in those 5 years with my family and friends, I avoided future funerals as much as possible. And I know that's not really the best thing to do, but when you're struggling with grief that much, seeing somebody else go through that just brings it all back, and it just is haunting. When going through grief, I suppose one of the biggest triggers that would open my book of grief was having to enter a funeral service and see that coffin with a body that people took their turn to pass by and give their final respect to. I would go on to lose two of my extremely close colleagues and friends over the next years, which I'll talk about later in another episode. I suppose the last thing I wanted to do was to go through my mother's things in her house after she passed. And so the family was doing that. I had an extremely difficult time even going to the house, much less going through her things, because they all brought back those memories that I really wasn't ready to face. She was, I believe, in a better place. I, on the other hand, was struggling once again with my grief for her. The only thing I could focus on now was making sure that my aunt was okay. And so that became my thing, to take care of my aunt. And I remember how stressed it was the first visit I made to her after Mom passed, where I had to tell my aunt that her sister had passed. And believe it or not, she was very cut and dry, simple-minded, if you could say, but she accepted things readily, and she had accepted the fact that she had lost her mother, my grandmother, and believe it or not, she was very accepting of this. And when I said, she just pointed to the sky and said, she's now in heaven with my grandmother, or with her mom. And whether I knew it then or not, my new responsibility would somehow help me in my grief for my mom. Because every visit I made with my aunt, I would think of Mom and how she handled things, and I would try my best to keep her wishes and honor my mom. I wonder, for those who've lost parents, how you deal with the grief upon the realization that you can no longer just pick up the phone and call them. I remember we kept my mom's phone active for a long time, and her voicemail was there. And I remember calling that number a few times just to hear that voicemail greeting so I could hear her voice one more time. Crazy as it may sound, I needed to do that. So what are some things that you do to remember and honor your loved one? How do they affect you? Does the process of honoring your loved one bring comfort and help with grief or not? I would challenge you as we enter a new year to take a fresh look at your walk with grief and find healthy ways to remember, to honor, and cherish those you've lost. Until next time, I wanted to let you know that we're on multiple podcast sites. We're now on YouTube, Spotify, Rumble, LinkedIn, Facebook, X, Apple Podcasts, iHeart, and Buzzsprout. And more to come. So just remember, as we close today, to stay strong. Thank you for your support. Thank you for your stories. I hope to have some guests on the show in the near future discussing their grief. So once again, stay strong. Thanks.